Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and we're in the second week of this series of how to live no matter what, based on the book of Ecclesiastes. And I can't stop smiling because just before we hit record, we were talking about how none of this matters.
How none of this matters, yeah. Well, I'll take us off. Do you know how listeners of this podcast and watching it on YouTube or CFC Wired, wherever you get it, know that John often, I have an issue, and that is like people will say things and immediately I'll start making an 80s reference or song. Sure. And John, if you are an astute listener, often tries to bait me many times. You don't even need to do anything. I looked at the name of this series and I thought to myself, we've called it How to Live No Matter What. And I thought that is a great 80s song. Just a great 80s title. I don't know. It kind of sounds like I Need a Hero in my head. Yep. A little bit of that sort of stuff. None of this has to do with what we're going to talk about, though. So there you go.
That could be a fun year, though, because we basically did a series on I Need a Hero. Yeah. So maybe you just do a year where it's all secret 80s references.
All secret 80s references? Yeah.
I feel like you've earned it by this point.
Well, there you go.
You've put in your time.
Hey, funny, we're going to talk about that earning it, one of the reasons later on why we think certain things should happen a certain way in this series, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah. So if you're just joining us, welcome. We're glad you're here. Last week, Brian introduced us to just the first couple of verses of the first chapter of Ecclesiastes, and Solomon making this, what seems like a declarative statement on the surface, but it's not. It's actually an inquisitive statement of, is life really meaningless? Because frankly, it sure seems like it sometimes. And you talked about this Hebrew word hevel that we have a hard time in English translating directly, but it's really not just that life is meaningless or life is pointless or life is vanity, as some of your translations say, but really just that life is incredibly difficult to grasp, to make sense of, to draw clean, clear conclusions from when I want them and how I want them.
And for those of us who like life in a nice little box, and I know you're out there because I'm sitting at this table and I'm one of them, that's monumentally frustrating sometimes.
Yeah, this ain't it. You came to the wrong life. Sorry. But believe it or not, we're actually going to keep going in this series. This is week 2 of 7 as we move through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we learn from what on the surface seems like the discouraging wisdom of Solomon, but is actually incredibly hope-filled and directional. And so today, this is, I promise you, hope-filled and directional. We're going to talk about how nothing is new and you will be forgotten.
Yeah.
So tell us about Sunday, Brian.
All right. So if you haven't joined us on any Sundays yet, we always do encourage that it's helpful to listen to Sunday before you listen to this. I'm going to say that of any series that we've done in a long time, this is probably even more so for this series. It doesn't mean that you can't listen to this and then go back, but I want to frame up this series. I did a little bit last week on the podcast. I've certainly done it on Sunday mornings, is that he starts with this premise, that life is meaningless. This is one of his statements. It's hevel. It's like a vapor. It can't be fully grasped. That's what that word hevel is probably better translated as. And he then asks the question, well, what does a man gain from all his toil, the things that we do, man or woman, from life under the sun? Said differently, all this stuff that we do while we're alive, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference? And what happens in the book of Ecclesiastes is then what's compiled by an author about Solomon, who makes all these statements. So there's a compiler on the book on the ends of, so at the beginning of chapter 1, the end of chapter 12, who put together all of these statements of Solomon for us to process. Solomon, the wisest, highly powerful, if not the most powerful man on the planet at the time, and richest man in the world, basically went on a big lab experience of life. And throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, what he's doing is he's confronting the things that culture, the world will tell us, will give us significance and matter in a life apart from God. And so actually this Sunday was titled Confronting Legacy. What we think about legacy, where we focus. Brian May actually wrote a song for Queen. If you don't know that song, here is a reference already asking this question: who wants to live forever? Now, quick little 80s trivia for you. Do you know what movie that's from, John?
Highlander, isn't it?
Yes, there can be only one. And so Queen wrote it for that. And it's about this movie Highlander, which has nothing to do with it. But the truth is, it's a great question because a whole lot of people want to live forever. Even if we don't recognize, if we recognize we can't live for 1,000 or as Methuselah did 969 years, we want to make a forever impact. We think about legacy. And so when dealing with legacy, during this section of our time together, we're looking at this theme. Now, pause note. We're not looking at every verse in Ecclesiastes in this series. We're looking at the themes that Solomon pursues to give him significance apart from God. Because he makes this premise. One, if this life is all that there is, live for yourself, do what you want. Or two, even though life can't be grasped, there is more to this life, and that's so, even if we don't understand it, choose to trust God. Spoiler, that's how he ends Ecclesiastes. There's the hope. But we're not to chapter 12 yet. We're still in chapter 1, and we'll be in the chapters leading up to it, where he is living out this experiment. And what is happening at the end of every one of these experiments is he's saying, try this, still meaningless. Mm-hmm. He doesn't give us how to live until the end. But he's going through this. And so what he's doing today is dealing with this idea of legacy. And I want us to understand this. This world turns and turns and turns and turns. And that is a beautiful thing. But it also means this. There's nothing new. And every single one of us on this side of eternity will be forgotten. So thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I know that's been super exciting to talk about. But left by itself, right? Option one, that's dystopian. That's live for yourself. Well, if I'm going to forget, let me just live it up, right?
Right.
But what if there's option two, right? And that's what we're exploring in many ways. Because this idea of fame, this idea of someone goes, oh, I remember having, the metaphorical or real picture up on the wall of, your home or building, like that is someone who made that. All of us at some level, we desire that. And the question isn't necessarily, is legacy wrong? Yeah. That's not really the question. It's, where are we trying to get a legacy, where it lands, right? Yeah. So there you go. That's it in some nutshells.
Yeah. And so I had some new thoughts as you were talking that weren't in the notes. And so I feel like I want to start here, that to that statement of wanting a legacy isn't wrong. It's how do we go about it? Yeah. Right. It's the fundamental undergirding question of all of Ecclesiastes is there meaning to life? Mm-hmm. And the answer is yes. The answer is definitively yes, but not if you try to find meaning this way. Correct. Which is the whole point of Solomon's experiments.
Yeah, and the thing that I love about this is, obviously it's in the Bible, but, God in his wisdom gave Solomon wisdom. Yeah. Gave him all of this so that from an earthly standpoint, it is impossible to look at the resources, the power, and the intelligence of this human being and say, well, they forgot something, or it could have been different if they could have bought this or done this. All of that's covered.
Yeah. Yeah, this is about as exhaustive as you could get.
Correct.
And what I love is that what he draws our attention to is all these other things that we would be tempted to try don't work. And like you said, at the end of this book, he points us back to a reality that the rest of the scriptures describe, which is, one, who wants to live forever? Well, you get to. Yeah. You get eternity with God. And God will never forget you. In fact, if you fast forward to the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the legacies of faithful followers of God whose contributions, not only to life on this earth, but to the kingdom eternal, have never been and will never be forgotten for as long as this book is in existence. And even if for some reason this book stopped existing, God's remembrance of those people who now live in eternity is secure. Yep. And we are invited to join this great cloud of witnesses, as the 12th chapter of Hebrews talks about, whose stories are known not only by the one who made you, but by those with whom you now share this great cloud of witnessing with, right? There is legacy. There is eternity. There is a way to be remembered. And there's a way to try to be remembered that will ultimately fail you. And if we try to go that route, as Solomon points out, we will be forgotten. And so we're going to talk about this. And again, you look at the book of Ecclesiastes one way, it seems like this is an incredibly depressing and hopeless book. But you look at it another way, and it's incredibly hopeful and direction setting. And so that's where we're going today. If you're brand new to Faith Forward, this is what we do. We take what we talk about on Sunday, and then we figure out, all right, how do I live in light of it?
Yep.
So really, Ecclesiastes might be like the poster child chapter for...
It could be, like we have a lot of alternate names. Maybe we call this the ecclesiastical life. I don't know. That seems really wordy, though. We'll have to figure something else out.
Yeah, and it's weird for 3 words to be really wordy.
Yeah.
But here we go anyway. So you said this probably on Sunday, which is always a challenge when we pre-record, because this wasn't, as I mentioned, as you and I were talking beforehand, this wasn't one of the bold sections in your notes. It wasn't one of the underlined sections. It wasn't one of the highlighted sections. It was just a sentence in the middle of a paragraph. So maybe you'll say it, maybe you won't, but it smacked me.
Well, I'm probably definitely going to say it now.
Well, thanks. But you said, most people never achieve lasting fame, while those who do gain nothing by it. And I just sat there looking at that for a second and just sort of went, because it's true. Mm-hmm. It's true. And there's any number of people who, even while they're living this life and are trying to achieve fame, have come to the conclusion that this didn't satisfy. This did not satisfy. The thing that I've chased my whole life, I got there, and it didn't do it. And I know some people might remember it, but for the most part, most people aren't even aware of it now while I did it, let alone will remember it. And so we start in this place of longing for legacy isn't wrong. In fact, I would argue, I think it's actually something that God places in us as part of this longing for eternity and longing for, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, a longing for a life that ultimately results in laying up treasures in heaven, investing in the kingdom which is eternal and which has eternal impact. And so at its root, this desire for a legacy is a desire to know that my life mattered, that my life made a difference. And I think every single person on this planet has experienced that feeling at some point. But here, right here is where we run into this issue of hevel again, is when we say, I want to know that my life mattered. I want to know that my life made a difference. Well, how do we measure what mattered? How do we measure what made a difference? That, again, is a place where it's not that it's meaningless. It's just really hard to grasp.
And one of the things that happens throughout Ecclesiastes is some of the things that we're going to talk about later in the future are things that we often use to measure, does it make a difference?
Yep.
Just a heads up, Solomon was the richest man who lived. And at some point, we're going to talk about fiscal stuff in this series. And he's got all of this. And it didn't leave the legacy that he thought. And so that's, God in his wisdom, obviously Solomon in his wisdom. This is, even though it's wisdom literature, it is very specifically laid out to help us understand. He starts with this base of legacy. And then he talks about all these other things later on that we think are going to be, remember, that give us success. Right? And success is really interesting. I would like to say this. Before we get even farther in this, I imagine that the vast majority of people who are listening to this are of a particular age where at least one person, if not two or many people, have looked at something you're doing at your job and given you a grade, a performance review. What I find interesting is that if success had a universal definition on this planet, someone would crack the code to figure out how to always get a 5 out of 5. But it doesn't. It's got so much perspective to it, pejorative definitions. There's a list of things like that. Why we see people all the time who, get really good performance reviews from one boss, does the same job, gets a new boss, and now they're not, is it all relative, or is there something else? And this is what he's pushing towards, that there is a different way to define success, but it all depends on where our audience is.
My wife, Brooke, has been doing her Bible in a year plan, and she's, right now in the Old Testament, and has been spending some time in Joshua. And so we've been talking a little bit about what she's been reading, and it reminded me again that I've had this thought from time to time. Like the end of the book of Joshua, I think is probably one of the greatest epitaphs that you could ever ask for. That Joshua 24, verse 31, the people of Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, those who had personally experienced all that the Lord had done for Israel. All the people of Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible, especially when you look at everything that came before, as Moses is leading a very disgruntled people out of Egypt, who then don't quite get into the promised land as it seemed like the timing would indicate initially, and then wander through the wilderness for a while. And Joshua's the one that gets them in. Mm-hmm. And so when he dies, his legacy, it seems like, is, and everyone believed, and everyone followed, and there was unity, and there was purpose, and there was celebration, and then you literally turn the page to the beginning of Judges. Yeah. One page, and you look at Judges chapter 2, verse 10, and it says, after that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. The Israelites then did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. And they abandoned the Lord to serve. And you're like, serious? That was one page.
Yeah.
That was one page. Mm-hmm. And it struck me too, and I had to do some internet searching to confirm this. Joshua doesn't really show up again. His name gets mentioned, I think, twice more, and once in a lineage, and once as a reminder of, yeah, he was the guy that brought you into the promised land, and ever since then, this has been a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
He's never mentioned again in the Old Testament. And just like this book of Ecclesiastes, in this space where we have to internalize the things that we now want to talk with you about, just, it made me sit there and think, like, man, like, you know, we think about the players that bring championships to cities that have had a championship drought forever, not to poke a sore spot. But
that's okay.
This guy brought a people, 1 million plus people out of captivity and into a promised land, and then helped them to take hold of it. Mm-hmm. And then he's forgotten.
And for those of us who are like, man, look at all he did, what hope for us? Again, we could say, well, then, all right, I'm going to be forgotten. So option one,
right.
Live for myself, do whatever, because even if I do all these good things, I do all that sort of stuff for other people, and clearly Joshua had a life that did that, they're not going to remember, so why do I even try? Yeah. Why do I even try? Just do and live for me. Hold on, understand the temptation, right? But Solomon's going to say there's another way. And so it's really about how we measure what matters and the difference. You know, you asked this question, John, like, what are the internal statements you find yourself agreeing with related to legacy? Mm-hmm. And when I read that, it was a reminder of how easy there are certain things in my life that I think if blank happens, then something significant is going to be for the kingdom through me, right? Maybe, but one of the things that as I began to reflect around this question is, hope you do, like that internal statement, like, all right, if I'm just able to have enough physical resources, or if I'm just able to get this blank, or get this spouse, or raise my kids, all of those things, good things, not bad things. But if we think that becomes our definition of legacy and success, what we wind up doing is chasing that aspect instead of option two, trusting to live after God, which, by the way, may result in some of those things. Yep. But it's the difference in what is our goal and our way of living. And that's why we've actually called the series How to Live No Matter What. Because there are lots of people who choose option two and get all the beautiful things. Yeah. And there are lots of people who choose option two and get none of the beautiful things, and it seems horrible, and life is hevel and cannot be grasped. Yep. But we do know, as a reminder, that God sees them. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah. So seriously, take a second, maybe just pause us. We'll wait for you. And sit with the question of, what would I define as the necessary elements of leaving a legacy? What are the things for me that feel like non-negotiables? What are the things that feel like absolutes? What are the things that feel like if I didn't have this, then it wouldn't be possible for me to leave a legacy? Yeah. It might be things like, well, I would have to have a meaningful relationship that lasted the duration of my life. I would have to have children, because honestly, how can you have a legacy if you don't have a next generation? I would have to leave something for that next generation to have. Otherwise, what have I really done with my life if I didn't set them up for greater than what I had? I would have to build something. I would have to build something physically that outlasted me, whether it's actually structural, a actual building, a statue, a monolith of whatever sort, or I would have to build an institution or a process, or I want something named after me. Sit with it for a second and see what comes up for you. What does it feel like would have to happen for you to have a legacy? And if you paused this and you just now came back, the sad punchline of option one is there's nothing new, and you will be forgotten.
Yeah.
There was a Facebook reel that my wife sent me that, again, I feel like I'm just in this space of just getting floored by things that I just never saw this way. The reel started off with this little kid, jumping in a puddle. And it began to run through the math of, for you to be here, it took two people. In whatever form or fashion that looked like for you, it took two people. And each of those two people required two people for them to be here. And then, so each of your grandparents then required two people for each of them to be here. So we've gone from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 pretty quick, and the math just keeps doubling. For you to be here, if you go back 12 generations, which is about 400 years, give or take, it took 4,094 people for you to exist. And I don't know how close you are with your family. I don't know how much time you've spent digging into genealogy, but the rough math in my head says that you probably don't know 99% of those 4,094 people.
I was reading this and I was convicted, and I was actually trying to do it there. My great-grandfather, who passed away when I was younger, I spent a little time with him, knew him. But if you ask me his first and middle name, I can't tell you.
Yep.
It was Pappy Bales, right? That was his name.
That was
right?
his name, yeah.
And that's fine. I don't, I'm like, what actually was, right? So I'm probably have to make a call. Mom and Dad, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry, just, text me that. But yeah, no, I'm like, oh, and I don't exist, but 3 generations back without him. But it moved from there are just so many things that I don't know. I mean, you know what? I do know he loved Arby's. I do know that. He loved Arby's, right? I do know some things like that. Yeah. But the farther that you go back, and one of these things about legacy is that there's a difference, and I want to make sure that we understand this, between someone knowing your name and being known. Yeah. Someone knowing your name is not leaving a legacy. Yeah. We know Abraham Lincoln, but Abraham Lincoln is not known. He's like, well, yes, he is. Well, here's a fundamental problem. What you do is not who you are. Yeah. What you do is not who you are. We know things that Abraham Lincoln did, but we don't know Abraham Lincoln. It's not possible. And in some ways that sounds depressing, but if we're able to reorient ourselves around legacy and impact isn't always about what we do and the way we think it should be done, then we will be known, maybe not on this side of eternity, but by the one who matters more and most in the other side of eternity. Yeah. Yeah. And so again, just sit in this space for a second. For you to be here took the work of 4,100 other lives. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't be here without them. And so you matter. You matter. You are precious and you are intentionally created. You were planned. No matter what your parents said, God planned you and created you intentionally. And you will be forgotten. You might even be forgotten in 3 generations, let alone 12. Yeah. You might just be remembered by a nickname and a Arby's. Preferred restaurant. Yeah, Arby's. He loved Arby's. He really did. But you will not be forgotten by the one who made you. You will not be forgotten by the one who made you.
And so when we are trying to measure the impact of our life, when we are trying to figure out if our life mattered, the answer is not our life is meaningless. Mm-hmm. But the answer is that meaning, impact, is hevel. It is almost impossible to grasp. It is almost impossible to figure out how much of a difference and how long-lasting that difference will be. Bring you back to Joshua. It seems like that is monumental impact and life change. And then you literally turn the page.
Because we're always trying to measure it in the here and now.
Yes.
And it cannot be made. The conclusion of the matter that he comes to at the end of chapter 12 is this. Now that all has been heard, this is what I conclude. Fear God, keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. I'll talk a little bit Sunday about what fear is. It's not living in trepidation. It's a little bit like looking at a lion. Know the glory, know the majesty, know the power. You can even be a friend, but don't ever forget their lion, right? And in that way, to quote C.S. Lewis, we've gone a little while to do it, from Narnia, when they ask, he's a lion, is he safe? Beaver says, of course he's not safe, but he's good, I tell you. I live in that reality. So we're going to, talk about measuring impact, measuring lives change. It's hard to do that. But, you used to teach history for a long time. And there was a thing that people used to say to you a lot in class, right?
Yeah, it was always interesting that as teenagers, if you could get them to start being interested in the history of the planet, that you start telling them stories about people, and people that in many cases they'd never heard of, and people that did amazing things that had been forgotten until the story was remembered or retold. And then many times some of those kids would go off and start doing their own internet digging. Back in the day, you go to the library, pull out encyclopedias. Those days are gone. But then they'd come back with stories of people that either I was familiar with or in some cases I'd never heard of. And they'd tell these amazing stories about these amazing people who did incredible things. And they'd say, how come we don't teach this person? Mm-hmm. And, you start to do the math of them of like, all right, if we try to tell every single person's story that ever lived, like you're never graduating. You want to move on with your life. But it was such a cool space to see them begin to discover the reality of just how many people's stories have had an effect on the world or a subset of it. Mm-hmm. How many people's stories have had an effect on humanity or a subset of it. And how many of those people have been forgotten by humanity or a subset of it. And how many of their contributions to the world have been forgotten by the world or by a subset of it. And it impressed upon me again as I was thinking back over it, because I continue to find amazing things that happen throughout history, that there's a part of me that's like, you were a history teacher, you should know that. And I tell that part of me very politely to shut up. But your life is going to have an effect. I can promise you that. Your life is having an effect and will continue to have an effect for the duration of your life on this planet. For the duration of your life under the sun, your life will have an effect. And that effect will be forgotten, including by many of the people whose lives were affected by you. As a classroom teacher, it embarrasses me a little bit that I can only distinctly remember maybe a half dozen of all the teachers I ever had. I mean, you got 5 in elementary school, and then you got a few more in middle school for each grade, and then by the time you get to high school, you're getting 5, 6, 7, 8 a year. And I remember maybe 6 of them on a good day.
Listen, I was just trying to recall my daughter who's graduating high school, right? And if you know what it's like to have a kid in elementary school, you get to know their teachers really, really well. Yeah. She's only 18, and I think I can name 2. They're actual. I can see some of their faces, and then I'm like, was that my daughter's, or was my son? Now, my wife's a whole lot better than that, but I think I'm much more the rule, not the exception in that. Yeah. Which, for some people, again, if you're thinking, well, this is the reality of it, well, why don't I just live option 1? Right. Do what I want, go make enough whatever, go do enough whatever, go be enough whatever, live for yourself, because this life is all that there is. And I really want to say this, if that was true, makes total sense. Yeah. But Solomon's trying to even walk us through living this way. Even if you want to try, can't figure it out. It's meaningless. It's hevel. Yeah.
And so there is a way for life to have meaning.
Yeah.
There is a way to have a legacy. Like you said, we're going to talk a little bit later about what it really looks like to lay up treasures in heaven. But some of what I've had to remind myself of it is even just in this life on this earth, for me, people have affected me whose names I no longer remember. And that doesn't diminish the effect they had. Their legacy is living on through me, even as I've forgotten their name, which I feel bad about some days. You are going to have an effect. And even if the people don't remember that effect, the one who made you does. You've referenced several times the verse that is near the end of Ecclesiastes in the 12th chapter, where Solomon talks about, at the end, everything will be brought into the light.
Yep.
Every good deed and every evil deed. And we mentioned it last week. You mentioned in the class that we're teaching on Wednesday, or the class you're teaching on Wednesday night, that we often look at that and go, well, yeah, it's about time all the bad stuff that people did gets, brought into the light and they get what they had coming to them. But I've really been captured by all the good comes into the light, because there was one who saw it, who will never forget.
That's where legacy shows up.
That's where legacy
right? That's
shows
where
up.
In the positive way. Right? And again, you can have a negative legacy. You know, that's a story for a different time, but it's not missed. And I think lots of times the traps that we fall into is we attach impact to what is seen.
Yep.
We attach, and because certainly we live, especially in the Western world, a very measurable, instant impact. But that isn't how Scripture talks about it. That isn't how God talks about it. And frankly, a lot of things that we think are impact, and a friend of mine once said, be very careful, because a lot of times we impact by growth, right? Said, be careful about growth, measuring it that way, because nothing grows faster than weeds. And sometimes it takes a long time to figure out if it's weed or something else.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, that's a good reminder. Then I go back and I struggle with it still.
Yeah.
But, we fall into traps.
Yeah.
And I think some of these traps are in and of themselves flat out traps. I didn't say that well. I think independently everyone can see that they're traps. To say the second thing, some of these become traps not because our heart isn't to make a difference, but we go towards that instead of following God, the wrong audience. So it's this idea, you said it last week, I always get the quote wrong, if you seek after blank, you won't get God. But if you seek after God, you could get both.
Yeah.
And so if you're seeking after certain things, and so I think a lot of times, especially around legacy, if you're listening and we're believers, like, well, why wouldn't I want to do this and try to do this? No one's saying you shouldn't, but who are you doing it for?
Yeah.
Are you doing it for God? Because one of the things that blows me away is that we know that God sees everything. And we take some encouragement, I think. Again, Jeremiah as an actual person isn't known, but what he did, what we would say, it'd be easy to say he had no legacy based upon an American idea, because he's 40 years and 0 converts. I mean, no one's ever inviting to be at any sort of conference to speak. Right? Hey, come listen to the guy who served faithfully for 40 years and no one said yes to God. No one wants to hear that.
Yeah.
We want to hear Peter, who stood up and all of a sudden 3,000 people come to know Jesus. But we also know that God saw it. And when we think about legacy, we go to, again, the end of the book. It says, fear God, obey his commandments. Legacy is going to be measured ultimately not in what we perceive to be results this side of eternity, but what God sees on the other side of eternity that we will join him in sometime from obedience and following what he asks us to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned these traps. We're going to share 3 of them. Not that that's an exhaustive list, but that seems like a good place to start. One of the places that we can fall into the trap of trying to establish legacy apart from God, and frankly, sometimes even legacy for God, is when we try to have impact everywhere. And so one of the traps that we fall into is we get so busy trying to have an effect, trying to have meaning everywhere, that we forget the place where we've been planted.
Yep.
That where you are right now is not by accident. God has placed you somewhere. And that was one of the things that as we moved our church to this building, we realized we needed to be very intentional about. because where our building was located previously, we were in the middle of data centers. It was really hard to be neighborly with data centers. But now that we found ourselves moving into a space that had a little bit of community and was on the verge of having a whole lot more, we wanted to make sure that we were intentional here, even as we made sure that we had impact outside. Mm-hmm. And so we came up with this statement of we want to be indispensable to the community within 3 to 5 miles.
Yeah.
Because if we're not making a difference, if we're not having a meaningful impact here and our focus is everywhere but, we've missed something about where we've been placed. And so this is one of the traps that we can easily fall into, is where we've been placed, there is the opportunity for effect. There is the opportunity for meaning. There is the opportunity for significance.
And many of us don't like where we're placed. Let's just be honest. Yeah. We keep trying to fight away from it. And so I want to invite you to on your own time this week to open the Bible, read Acts chapter 17, verse 26 and 27. Oftentimes people call it the theology of place section of Scripture. And it says, you've been put by God where you are for a purpose and for a reason so that some people might come to know God. You are where you are on purpose. Are all the things that are happening to you what God wants? That's a different discussion. But you are where you're on purpose. And so living in denial of where you are is in many ways trying to find legacy in a way that God has not designed it to happen. And so certainly we can talk geographic things we talked about as our church, but you got a family.
Yeah.
You have a place where you work. And I know some of you are like, how can where I work right now be where God put me? Doesn't mean God can't put you somewhere else, but you are where you are right now. Develop and cultivate and follow God, fear His commandments, knowing that everything will be seen, whether it is evil, yes, but the good, faithfully be there. That's part of making legacy where God has, because believe it or not, as followers of Jesus Christ, we're part of His plan. Crazy that we are, but we're part of His plan. Yeah. And so instead of trying to be everywhere, be here. So, if you're listening and you're part of Christian Fellowship Church, it's not that we don't care for people beyond 5 miles. Yeah. We do. Absolutely we do. We don't say, oh, you're 5.2 miles. We don't want to serve you.
Sorry. Yeah.
Right? But at the same time, we also understand that strategically we've been placed. So we can have a bigger legacy, but let us never say we're going to try a different legacy, because that's not possible.
Right.
This is where God has called us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know I've heard you talk about this, that, it's so easy for people in ministry to get so focused on all the people in need and miss the family at home.
Yeah.
You hear this about doctors, right? You're so focused on curing all the people that are ill or injured or in need, and you barely see the family at home. And so it's not that you should ignore everyone. We're such people of absolutes. Well, is it all one or all the other? Well, no.
Yes.
No.
It's both.
But don't neglect the one while you're also not neglecting the other. Mm-hmm. Because there's a reverse side to this too, that sometimes you'll have a hard time making a difference. Sometimes you'll have a hard time making the difference you want where you are. Jesus said this thing that bothers me sometimes. He said a lot of things that bother me, frankly, but this one in particular for this moment, he said, a prophet is honored everywhere except in his own hometown and among his own family. And I have to imagine, looking at the humanity of Jesus, how frustrating it must have been to see the people that knew him best because they've known him longest not see him as he was. Well, not see him as he is, only see him as he was. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about this ahead of time, and I can say this safely because of what I'm about to say. There's not a single person I'm related to that watches this podcast other than my wife. And that didn't hit me until yesterday as I was putting these notes together, that there is no one within my family network, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, that engage in the things that I spend my time doing because I believe that they're having an impact. Yep. And that just took a moment to go, man, I really am trying to have an impact in my family. And I feel like I am in other places, but the things that I spend most of my weekdays doing, the Venn diagram of overlap there is pretty slim at the moment.
Yeah, but that also brings up when you say at the moment.
At the moment.
Right? Because one of the things, again, we often do with legacy is it needs to be measured now.
It needs to be measured now.
And, Paul in the New Testament, he's talking about how things function in the kingdom. And he said, we all have differing roles. Sometimes we play all three of the roles. Sometimes we play one of the roles, and sometimes we play a different of those roles. And he was saying that, when it comes to impact for the kingdom, right, in this case, legacy, some plant, some water, others get the harvest. And I think most of us feel very uncomfortable with the planting.
Yeah.
Especially if, we don't feel like we ever get to see the harvest. Because one of the things about this life, being hevel can't fully grasp, is that there is no predetermined gestation period for anything.
Yes.
There isn't. And we look at a baby and we say 9 months, right? We look at elephants at 2 years or something like that.
Yeah.
Here's what I do know. If you plant corn at the right time, it should be knee-high by the 4th of July if you come from the Midwest, right? There's a predetermined thing. That's not how life this side of eternity works. But we become very, very frustrated if we feel like, hey, we're doing all the things that God has commanded us, but we're not seeing the harvest. We're not seeing the development. Yeah. So this must be meaningless, as in nothing matters.
Right.
Just live for myself. I tried this, and since I didn't see the benefit, that's, again, not how it works.
Yeah.
And we have to be careful for that.
Yeah. Right. So again, it's not meaningless, it's hevel. And we can live in the tension of hevel a whole lot easier than we live in the reality of meaningless.
Yep.
May take a little practice, but you can do it. So first trap, you've been placed where you are for a reason. Let your life be meaningful there instead of trying to be meaningful everywhere. The second trap is sometimes you'll have a hard time making a difference in the places where you want to make a difference, in the places where you have been placed. And so don't fall into the trap of measuring prematurely.
Yeah.
The third trap is when we try to define what a successful life is, not just in timing, but in scope, in consequence, in significance. And so realize that this is where some of the battle is most effectively fought in our day-to-day relationship with God. And it's where the battle needs to be fought in our day-to-day relationship with God, because some of those preconceived definitions of what a successful life equals come from the enemy. And those lies have to be uncovered. Those agreements have to be broken. Those deceptions have to be replaced with truth. And you notice that the enemy does this from the beginning of this book when he's in the garden with Adam and Eve. And part of what he's pointing out to them, or part of what he's trying to get them to believe, rather, is your life isn't as meaningful as it could be. There is something that is within your grasp for you to take that would give you even greater significance, even greater consequence to your life. And so you should do that, and you should do it soon. In fact, you should do it now. You shouldn't wait. Grasp it, because that will give you what you're looking for. And he offers the same temptation to Jesus. The first time it's just fix your hunger. And the second time it's, prove that you have the power to command. But the third time it's, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth now. You can have significance now. You don't have to wait. I'll give you all of it. And Jesus very rightfully recognizes that that's not it. That's not it. And oh, by the way, I'm getting it all anyway. My dad's giving it to me. But notice that there are probably some embedded definitions in you that are just fundamentally not true. That if I had this, I would have significance. If I had this, my life would have consequence. If I had this, my name would be remembered. That's a good place to spend some time with God. Ask him to reveal those, and then ask him what the truth is. But also realize that we not only are at war with the enemy, but we are at war with our flesh. And that some of these things really just come out of the broken, unhealed parts of us that, as we talked about in our last series, need to be put to death. They're not things that are coming back. This is the old man that needs to stay dead instead of us trying to bring him back to life. And if you missed some of that, jump back a couple episodes. Lee and I talked about it. But some of these wrong conclusions about significance, consequence, legacy come from the parts of us that really just want things to be comfortable, that really just want things to be easy, that really just want life now the way that I want it. And those need to be resisted, because those will absolutely interfere with laying up treasures in heaven. And then also realize that some of the conclusions that we have about what will give us significance, consequence, legacy, they're not necessarily from the enemy, and they're not necessarily from the flesh, but they are an immature version of who God is calling us to be. And I can't think of a better example for this than the Apostle Paul, who is fairly convinced at the outset of his ministerial life that he knows exactly what God wants, and he knows exactly how to go about bringing God glory and laying up treasures in heaven by persecuting all these radical, foolish followers of this Jesus guy and preserving the sanctity of the faith because God would want that. And you see that all of that zeal and all of that passion and all of that certainty gets utilized a few days, weeks later, when his focus and his internal world are suddenly shifted. And so recognize that some of what may be driving you towards significance and consequence and legacy may not be from the enemy, and it may not even be from the flesh. It may just be from an immature version of you that God is in the midst of growing up.
You know, I was reading that, and I had a personal reflection because, we think about the immature version, through Paul, and he hadn't yet had a relationship with Jesus Christ, and that would bring about maturity that he would step into. But some of us have an immature version of ourselves, and we still do. And here's an example. I've shared this at one point, I think, in the podcast before. I know John and I talked about it before this podcast, and we've talked about it many times. I had a well-meaning person at one point in my life. I can still hear them come in and say something over my life that said, you are going to be blank by using your gift of blank for the kingdom. Super well-meaning.
Sure.
And here's what happened. My call is to use my gift for the kingdom and then trust God with the results. But what happened, the immature version of myself never saw those things, and still to this day has never seen those things happen, right? It doesn't mean the person's wrong. Maybe it's going to happen, maybe it's not. But when the gestation period hadn't come about when I thought it was going to be, I began to think, I am not making an impact. I'm not leaving a legacy. I'm not doing this because this hasn't happened. And what was interesting is I was using the same skills and giftings and talents and just gifts that God has given me, but I was focused the wrong way. Instead of focusing towards God and trusting him with legacy and trusting him with impact because he sees everything and he doesn't miss it, I began to try to measure it that way. And if there's any one thing I could say to you on this podcast is this, is that one of the best ways to help determine whether you're making an impact is this. Number one, the right legacy, ask God, right? That's number two. But number two, review your audience. Ask God, am I even rightfully focused the wrong way? But two, where is my focus on? Like when I wake up on a Sunday morning, I have to ask God, let my focus be on you today, not on other things that seem to be good when we come to Christian Fellowship Church that may or may not represent you. God, this, let's that. And so, again, the subject is, for a lot of us, this seems dumb. This seems good. But we have to come to grasp with this idea that the things that this world tells us will give us meaning and leaving a legacy do not last. We will be forgotten. And everything that invites us to live a life apart from God, it will not last. But God does exist. And there's another choice. There's another way.
Yeah. God does things that matter. Said another way, God doesn't do things that don't matter.
Yep.
You are invited into a life of incredible meaning and purpose and adventure and possibility and influence. As you close most every service on Sunday when you preach from the end of Ephesians 3, now to him who's able to do immeasurably more than all we ask for or imagine, right? That right there says there is purpose, there is significance, and there is a level of quality and quantity that we cannot grasp, both now and forever, because of his power. According to his power, that is at work within us. If his power is at work within us, God is doing things that matter. He doesn't do things that don't matter. He didn't put his power in you. He didn't put his life in you because life is meaningless. That doesn't make sense. That's not his character. That's not his nature. He does things that matter. He put his power that matters into you who matters to do things in this life that matter. And there are incredible rewards for obedience. Jesus tells the parable of the master and the servants who were obedient with what was entrusted to them, who did it in keeping with the character and nature of the master because they knew him. To them the master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." There's an eternity of celebration coming for your faithfulness and your obedience. And you will be forgotten here, but not by the one who created you. This book is full of good news, but it's going to require letting go of some things that part of us and part of this world insist could possibly be true if we just try hard enough. And they can't. Solomon tried it. But friends, there's so much more.
Amen.
So until next time, when we talk about this some more, he's Brian, I'm Jon. Thanks for being a part of this journey with us. We'll see you next time.